In humanitarian settings, GBV survivors are sometimes asked to describe their experiences of GBV in details within the context of MHPSS services or GBV response services. So anytime a service provider asks GBV survivors to describe their experience of GBV in details, we can use the term exposure techniques. The MHPSS intervention that incorporates exposure techniques may be conducted either individually or with a group. They can include specific exposure therapies, such as cognitive processing therapy and trauma-focused cognitive behavioral therapy. Exposure techniques employed in humanitarian settings include imaginal exposure. It's basically asking participants to vividly imagine and describe their experience of potentially traumatic events. And less commonly, in vivo exposure. It's asking participants to directly face feared situation, activities, or location in real life.
It is essential that the physical and psychological safety of GBV survivors is the first priority for all service providers. All service providers should assess safety individually with survivors and those at risk, and ensure that they understand their distinct safety concerns, including risk of ongoing violence, before engaging in any intervention. In a humanitarian setting, it's very difficult for the stabilization phase to be completed. A stabilization phase within psychosocial support usually requires several sessions with the participants to establish a trusting relationship with the clinician, establish conditions of safety and stability, strengthening coping mechanisms, and ensure that the participants' life circumstances allow them to commit to attending multiple sessions of psychosocial support over a prolonged period. The stabilization phase requires safety, stability, and no ongoing violence. Considering the high risks involved, it is not appropriate to use exposure techniques. Exposure techniques should only be used in stable security situations where violence is not ongoing and the stabilization phase has been completed.
In humanitarian settings, exposure techniques should not be used within group sessions. It raises red flags when working with GBV survivors in group settings and is not appropriate due to risk of re-traumatizations, triggering, stigmatizations, discrimination, shaming, and/or safety and security concerns. So the recommendation to not use exposure therapy in group settings also applies to refugee context, even where there are no emergency. And of course, perpetrators should not be included in any MHPSS sessions together with the survivors.
Service providers are recommended to remove the exposure element of transdiagnostic interventions when working with GBV survivors due to safety and risk concerns.
It is very difficult to safely use exposure therapy techniques with GBV survivors in an emergency setting, given to the instability, insecurity, and overall limited resources, which often leads to difficulties in providing sustained support or managing adverse reactions. In all emergency settings, exposure therapy should not be used within group sessions. In stable context, exposure therapy techniques may be considered on a case-by-case basis by trained professionals only, with strict caveats and safety considerations for the survivor.